Now then, about that lesson in Republican diplomacy. Republicans have never been shy about supporting, encouraging, and defending authoritarian and totalitarian dictatorships as long as they're our totalitarian and authoritarian dictatorships. Some examples from the past century. The Somoza dynasty in Nicaragua, put into power in the 1930s when the U.S. Marines invaded and threw out the corrupt government and replaced it with an even more corrupt government. And then there's the matter of Francisco Franco of Spain and his neighbor to the west, Salazar in Portugal. And there's also the matter of Iran. In 1953, the CIA deposed the elected prime minister and replaced him with the Shah of Iran. So for about 20 years, the United States and the government of Iran had a very close, very cordial, very friendly relationship, somewhat to the chagrin of the Saudis, who have never gotten along with the Iranians. The Iranians have never cared much for the Saudis, and the upshot of that today is the genocide in Yemen. I've already spoken about that. I'm not going to rehash that. And for the longest time, the great enemy of the United States was the Soviet scourge, as authoritarian and totalitarian a regime as you'll find, along with the People's Republic of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and let's not forget Fidel Castro and Ho Chi Minh, both of whom were nationalists rather than communists. They embraced Marxism as a political advocacy paradigm for improving the standard of living and the economy of their country. But the Republicans didn't see it that way because they don't understand Marxism. They do think they understand communism, and that is the big, horrible bugaboo in the Republican orthodoxy, communism. Because to the Republican way of thinking, communists are going to take everybody's property away. Well, that clearly is not true. Simply isn't the case. And history is full of evidence to refute the Republican propaganda. I'm not going to deliver that lecture right now either. I just wanted to point out that the reason so many Republicans think so highly of Vladimir Putin and the Russian regime today, as well as dictators in the Philippines, in, yes, even North Korea, and elsewhere around the world, is that Republicans like dictatorships. They like strong, powerful, unbeatable, irresistible leaders, strong men. And emphasis is on strong men because women just don't have what it takes to be a strong and powerful and decisive leader. So in addition to being anti-democratists, Republicans are also misogynists. They're sexists. I'll save that lecture for another time too. But the thing is, this is not a new thing with the Republicans. The biggest example of open and shameless, brazen affection for a ruthless dictator goes back to the 1930s. The Republicans thought Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were just the greatest thing ever. There were bonfire rallies. They were called Bund rallies. They were meant to demonstrate brotherhood or Bundkin with the Nazis in general, their movement in general, and Adolf Hitler in particular. These bonfire rallies very often degenerated into Klan rallies, but that's okay because everybody knew Everybody knew in the 1930s that the Nazis were racist. They didn't like blacks, they didn't like Jews, they didn't like Poles, they didn't like Slavs, they didn't like anyone who wasn't white and Nordic. They didn't much care for the French, but at least the French were, well, white. But back to the U.S. and the Bund rallies. Bund rallies were organized by an organization, or actually quite a few organizations, that wanted to demonstrate their like-mindedness with the Nazi movement in Germany. They very often invited, without much prodding, Republicans of the day, mostly Republican governors, Republican senators, Republican congressmen, and people who wanted to be Republican governors and senators and congressmen and state legislators. And because they were bonfire rallies in the manner of what was going on in Munich and Nuremberg and Stuttgart and everywhere else in Bavaria and eventually throughout Germany, well, if it's good enough for the Germans, it's good enough for us. These bonfire rallies were also attended by members of the Ku Klux Klan, also a friend of Republicans. So you have a long history, or actually I should say we as a nation have a rather long history of racism, institutionalized by the Republicans, supported by the Ku Klux Klan, and of course embraced and endorsed by red-blooded, red-necked Americans everywhere. So, here's the question, and I have an answer. What was it about the Nazis that appealed so strongly to the Republicans? Well, the racism was a convenient excuse. But what really appealed to the Republicans was the fact that the Nazis were rebuilding Germany. They were rebuilding German industry with, by the way, an awful lot of financial support and investment by American banks, American companies, including J.P. Morgan, more famously known today as J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. J.P. Morgan helped the Nazis. He financed them. Or more to the point, he financed the bankers in Germany who financed the Nazis. So while there might be 1 degree of separation between J.P. Morgan and the Nazi movement, it's only 1 degree of separation. And of course, J.P. Morgan, the famous American financier and banker, was a big supporter of the Republican Party. So of course, because the Republican Party is owned, managed and directed by corporate America, the Republican Party does whatever corporate America tells it to. It has always been that way since the Republican Party's founding in 1856. But that's another lesson for another time also. My point is that the Republican Party was the biggest supporter of the Nazi movement in the United States in the 1930s. Well, the Nazis are all gone. At least the German Nazis are all gone. Now we have Amerikanischen Nazis who are finding a home in the Republican Party, which is financed by American corporate interests. And the fact that the corporate interests of America are running the policy decisions and the diplomacy of the Republican Party explains why today the most authoritarian, the most successful authoritarian regime in the world resides in Russia. Make no mistake, Vladimir Putin is authoritarian and as totalitarian as Stalin, as the Tsars. I have referred to him more than once as Tsar Vladimir because there's no meaningful difference between Putin's policies and the Tsar's policies, or Tsarist policies. Political oppression is brutally repressed, political opposition, my mistake. Political opposition is brutally repressed in Russia. There is no free press. The Duma, which is the erstwhile legislature of the Russian government, is little more than a rubber stamp. Vladimir Putin tells the Duma what to do, and they do it. So Vladimir Putin presides over the most successful dictatorship in the world today. And the Republicans admire that greatly. Of course, the fact that Vladimir Putin has oligarchs around him, surrounds himself with businessmen who are very successful and very prosperous and very wealthy and very corrupt. They're as crooked as the Volga River. But still, they have wealth, and therefore they have political power and prestige and influence. And that's exactly what not just Donald Trump admires, but what the Republican Party admires. And you can Google much of this to confirm it, if you would only do so. I suspect, however, that most of you don't want to take the time to Google, so here I am. I'm telling you the high points of all this. I think that's about all I have to say for right now. Just wanted to bring this to your attention. Until next time.